Good morning, good evening, good whatever time you're listening to this podcast. My name is James Albarn, and welcome to episode 35 of The Last Line. Thank you very much for joining me. Today's episode is another conversation with a friend of the podcast, and I think it's his third time appearing on this podcast, actor extraordinaire Stephen Tobolowsky. We actually recorded this all the way in, I think, I want to say March of last year, May of last year. I think March, because we were still, as you will hear, in the UK, we were back into another COVID lockdown. But despite this podcast coming out quite some time later, I think it's a nice, interesting sort of time capsule of the moment. So, without further ado, here is Stephen Tobolowsky. So excuse my appearance because I haven't had a haircut since, I don't know, December or something.
You look exactly the same to me.
Don't say that. That's worrying. That's like, oh gee, like what?
You just look like you look like not a rocker, but one of those indie computer rockers. You know, like the German craft punk rockers. You know, you got the keyboard in the background and all the electronics, and you got the eyeglasses and the kind of shaggy hair. Now me, you know, I only get a haircut when I go do a TV show.
Right.
And then the people come out in spacesuits, you know, because of COVID and cut my hair. When you have no hair, it is very difficult to go without a haircut because it is not long before you start looking like a homeless person because it grows in back, you know, and down, and the sideburns grow down your face. So you start looking like some kind of Zacherle or some kind of character from Rocky Horror Picture. Riff Raff from Rocky Horror Picture Show. That's exactly what you look like. But you look you look like the collegiate kind of intellectual rocker. You know, what
Fine.
can I say?
I'll take that. I'm gonna use that. But yeah, because we've been in lockdown since. Well, I mean, we've had many lockdowns here, but we've been in lockdown again since basically January, and it is starting to wear on us all, I think.
It wears on you. And what do you find the element that wears the most on you?
That's a good question. I think that is a difficult question. I don't think I'd valued seeing friends as much as I probably should have before, like actually just seeing people. That's probably the biggest thing, right? Because like I've never been there's a huge pub culture over here, but I've never been one for, you know, I'm not really a go out drink kind of guy, so I don't really miss that kind of stuff. Although actually not having that option has been like, oh, actually I quite fancy going to the pub, but yeah, I think just seeing friends, I think, is probably the big thing. And as good as, you know, Zoom and FaceTime and all that kind of stuff is, it's just not the same, is it, as seeing someone properly and doing stuff together.
You know, with all the time off, because right now it is near the end of March, right? Beginning of April. Yeah. When we are speaking then like
about the same time as again last year and the year before.
Like at the end of March. At this time last year, I had finished shooting all of the One Day at a Time shows we were going to shoot. Yeah. And now we were waiting for the virus to pass so we could finish our season, which it never happened. And we ended up just getting canceled like a lot of other shows. And so I had a lot of time off to write my podcast, you know, just to do something creative. There was a desire to do something creative. And what you just said started coming back to me as I was writing some of the stories in the podcast. I was writing one story about when I was directing a play in New York and how we used to go to the pub every night. We used to go to this Irish bar. Yeah, New York is lousy with Irish bars. They're all over the place.
Yeah, there's tons of them, yeah.
And it wasn't just the idea of having a drink or playing darts. It was the whole cast would come, and we would almost celebrate the day, our victories and our defeats from rehearsal that day. And it was, I don't want to be too touchy-feely about it, but it was like our mirror. COVID brought home to me that we need a mirror. Like in the morning, I need a mirror to make sure there's nothing on my face that I don't want on my face. I have to make sure before I shoot a TV show, I don't have any lunch stuck in my teeth or anything for a close-up. But we need a mental mirror too, to bounce off who we are and what we are with other people, to hear their stories, to hear our stories, to go back and forth. And with COVID, there's been no mirror. And that's been the thing, what you say, the companionship, the one-on-one or one with many camaraderie, to know who we are and what are we doing, that's been gone, except with this meager format of Zoom that we have now.
And actually, it's funny we're talking about this. I suppose it was sort of inevitable, given that we haven't spoken since it all kicked off. But I read your blog post and I picked out a quote from it because I thought it was quite. It's basically what you said there. But it stopped and made me think a bit. And it's the last line of your Where's Waldo blog post, and I'll put it in the description of the podcast for anyone's listening who wants to read the whole thing. But you say, the fight of our lives isn't against a disease, it's to remember the holiness of the individual. And I thought,
that's for sure. And it's easy to make people as cordwood and, just throw them on the fire and everybody says, and I don't mean this to be controversial, but in America, the battle cry now is, we believe in science. Well, we believe in science. And I think that is not necessarily true. I don't think people believe in science. I think people say they believe in science only if it works as magic. I think people believe in magic. So if science can create a vaccine that can protect us from this invisible enemy, COVID, then I believe in science. But I think most people, at least here in America, haven't had a science class for years and years and years, and they could care less about it. They don't know anything about the Great Hadron Collider underneath Luxembourg. They don't know what subatomic particles they're creating. They don't care. They don't care unless it creates magic. When they cared is when they were talking about the Great Hadron Collider under Luxembourg, we found the God particle. And suddenly everybody was reading about the Great Hadron Collider and what they found, the God particle, the particle that began all matter and began the universe. And then they found out, oh, we didn't. We were wrong. We were wrong. We were wrong, which is a big part of science, is that you got to be able to say we're wrong a lot, because they are wrong a lot. I think that's one thing about COVID, is that science never really has gotten a grip on what this is and what's happening. And we feel we're in an era of black magic, and we're hoping for some white magic to come and chase it away. I don't know if we discussed this before, but in terms of the concept of holiness, did we discuss this in terms of the Hebrew words for holy?
We may have done, because we certainly touched on your religion, on Judaism before, and we mentioned about how you have, because we talked about like my guitars in the background, and you used those as a sort of comparison for me who isn't religious and you who is religious in terms of like sacred objects sort of kind of thing.
Well, it's I'll bring this up briefly because it's kind of interesting. Is that the idea of holy is not really true. It's not really. It was not a mistranslation, but it was an incorrect translation. It was in the Bible, so everybody read the Bible, so they know this word holy. But that's not where the concept comes from. It's a concept of time, and that is when the ancient Hebrews, they did not really value past, present, and future like we do. We say now there's 3 times. We're living in the present, future, past, blah, blah, blah. Back then, they believed time was on this big wheel, this big circle, and it was a continuum. So you had things that had come to pass, and there are things that will come to pass, but it was one big circle of time, except there's this another circle of time that is not connected with those. It is not that which has come to pass, that which is, that which will come to pass. It was separate. It was a group of elements and incidents which are separate from the continuum of time. And the ancient Hebrews called this kadosh. Kadosh, which means separate. But when the translators of the Bible were trying to translate that word, they were living under a different system of time. They were already into past, present, and future. And so they had no word to come up with separate, and separate didn't describe it, so they called it holy. So the things that were not part of the continuum of time were separate, but they became christened as holy. And I think that is one thing we've discovered in our lives. That's one of the things you discovered by we didn't go to the pub, is that we were missing that touch of something that is not connected to our past, present, and future, but is part of our holiness. It's a part of something that's disconnected from time, that is kind of eternal, that existed from before we lived until after we are gone. It will still continue to exist. And it's this thing that's separate, and it's the holiness of the human mind, the human spirit, whatever you want to call it.
I mean, all of this has been like just kind of horrible generally, right? Like there's not many positives you can draw from it. But the hope is, and I kind of go in waves in terms of whether I think this will actually happen or not, because there's a big part of me that's like pretty cynical about things, but there's the hope that like maybe out of all of this, and I'm sure there's been so many times through history where people have said the exact same thing that I'm saying now. I'm sure after like 9/11 happened, or, the Second World War, or whatever these big monumental events are, I'm sure everyone has said what I've said at some point, but about that you hope that maybe out of this becomes a greater appreciation of those kind of things. And because we're living through a time where everyone is affected in some way by it, that you hope that out of it will come that appreciation of what you're talking about.
Yeah,
if that happens or not, I don't know, but
well, it'll happen. Something will happen to some degree, and some of it'll be a mystery. We'll go like, oh, well, that really kind of came from COVID, from the COVID times. We just had Passover Seder. That was this weekend, and Easter, I think, is next weekend. And at the Seder, they always have this thing, the 4 questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? And the youngest child is supposed to ask the 4 questions. And they have odd questions. They go, why on all other nights we sit, or when we dine, on this night we eat reclining. Not that I eat reclining, but that's one of the questions. On all other nights we do not dip vegetables at all. On this night we dip twice. Why do we dip twice? So I'm going like, why are these weird things in these time-honored, celebration? Why are we talking about these things and I have no idea what they're talking about? It's because they came from great historical events that we don't know about, that we've forgotten. That people used to sit reclining because that's what people did in Hellenic Greece when the Jews were outcast in Greece, like centuries ago. And so they were going like, well, that's what the rich people in Greece did. And they dipped their vegetables twice, like they did in 640 BC when the Jews were outcast to Babylonia, and that's what they did in Babylonia. We don't know that anymore. So now we still have these questions that are remnants of a past, and we don't even know the huge events that created these questions historically. And we're going to have the same thing that happens with COVID. We're going to have remnants, minutia that in ways our life have changed. I don't know if restaurants and live theater is ever going to be the same in my life. Well, I'm almost 70, so I don't have that much more to go. But I'm saying, like, I can't imagine there being when I came out to Los Angeles, there were 1,100 theaters. 1,100. I'd like to see London do that. 1,100 theaters. Now, not big theaters, but little theaters. And everybody went to the theater, in this wasteland we call Los Angeles. I would be very surprised if we go back to a time in which we could fill 1,100 theaters. Can't imagine it. But we'll see. We'll see what it is. Tom Hanks said something funny this weekend. He said, well, I know one thing for sure about COVID. I'll never play solitaire again. And it's one of those things, oh yeah, I hear what he's saying. I'm not going to waste my time anymore with something like that. I'm not going to waste my time because this last year has been such a burden of feeling your life drifting by. And I think of the poor kids in school over here who have to be homeschooled, who end up not homeschooling and not playing with their friends. They're suffering too. They're not going to have the same education that other kids had or the same psychological well-being other kids had.
Yeah. And so what's it been like for you? Because you are, like, we say this every time you're on, but like, you're a very prolific actor. Like, you're always busy doing stuff. So what's that been like for you to suddenly just have to take a pause? I guess you've been working off and on recently, maybe, as stuff starts to open up. But
yeah, when One Day at a Time was on in January, not this January, but a year ago, this was before COVID started. I was doing One Day at a Time. I was doing guest spots on the Goldbergs, and I was doing guest spots on their spinoff show, Schooled. By the time COVID hit, we already talked, let's say March, like a year ago. One Day at a Time was done. Schooled had been canceled. And then I was just doing the Goldbergs. And off and on during this pandemic, I've done guest spots on the Goldbergs, which has been like a science fiction film. It's the COVID restrictions on Sony Studios, and I appreciate it. Bravo to them. Were so restrictive. You have to have a COVID test every 48 hours, and that may have even switched to 24 hours when the Abbott 15-minute test became very available. All the actors were put in plexiglass boxes in a trailer. So we were all separated. No one was close. We were walled off. The hair and makeup people did our hair and makeup usually outdoors. And like I said, they were wearing spacesuits, the mask, the visor, the gloves, the everything. And I remember Wendy and I were doing a scene, and we were numbered. Like there was the A plus, the A group, and the B group. And each of those groups had their own bathroom facilities. You couldn't go, the A plus had to go to the A plus, et cetera, et cetera. You couldn't go on stage. A plus, which were the actors, could not go on stage when any B was on the stage. The B had to be cleared from the stage, which was the crew, before we started working. And A group was like extras who played students. So everybody is coordinated as to when they come on, because we're doing a show about school, that we have a lot of people on set. So we rehearse with masks and with shields. Then we do camera blocking with the mask on and just the shield. And then we put the shields down and shoot. And you feel like you're absolutely naked when we suddenly have no shield on and no mask and you're actually doing a scene. And Wendy and I were in the middle of doing one scene, and the ADs came on the set. Everybody has to clear the stage. There's been a COVID break. And we felt like we were in a James Bond movie. We ran outside. They said, wait outside, we'll tell you what to do. Wendy and I ran outside. The camera people ran to their area, and they were separate from us. The extras ran outside. They were separate from the camera people and us. And then the ADs say, everybody go home. Everybody go home. We'll call you and we'll tell you what happened. And now I'm scared to death. So I go home. They call us up and they say one of the stand-ins, which was in the B group, tested positively for COVID and was on the same stage we were on. So the entire stage has to be disinfected. Everybody has to be retested. The next morning, Wendy and I came in and got the 15-minute Abbott test. We were good. The camera people were good. And we finished shooting the scene. And so you just have this other level of difficulty and terror that's behind everything. And that's what happened when I got my 2 vaccine shots. I almost started crying after I got the second one. Not that it was conscious, but I had this kind of feeling deep within my kadosh soul that somehow I was just made safer. I don't know how much safer. I believe in science, but I really believe in the magic of being slightly safer. And I began crying on the way home. I was so moved. And I think we've been under so much stress for so long. I did one movie during this COVID period of time. Oh God. It's going to be a low-budget movie because they're not going to waste money on an expensive movie that they can't release. So my dressing room was my car. I sat in the front seat of my car. I brought my own food, my own beverage. I had one bathroom in the house that was strictly mine to use. And it was terrifying. It was terrifying shooting that just as soon as we got on stage, taking the masks off again. It was, at the beginning I thought, come on, we could do this. And I felt kind of brave for being somebody who's going to do my job. And then as it kept happening, I began feeling like the biggest fool in the world. Do I want to die for doing the Goldbergs? Do I want to die doing a low budget movie? No. So, I will be very glad when the enormous risk of the invisible has been removed from our life.
Yeah, I mean, I nearly had it. It was very weird. And this was like a couple of months ago. And I'm pretty sure I've had COVID. We don't know. But I think I've probably had it but been asymptomatic because my girlfriend very early on in all of this, at the point where they weren't even testing people really,
right.
was really ill. And you look at all the symptoms and you go, she probably had it and has struggled. Her breathing's still it's better now, much better now than it was. But for ages, her breathing was not like what it should be. And as a singer, that's not the best thing. But so I'm pretty sure I had it, but was asymptomatic or whatever. But I was in just the supermarket, and suddenly I found myself in this queue where everyone was standing very close to me, and it was a small supermarket, and I didn't just drop my things on the floor and go because I don't want to be that guy. But I left the queue, put all my stuff back and left because I suddenly had this almost just sudden panic of being that close to people. And I don't know what it was. I'm not in a, COVID is scary and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not in a category where it's maybe going to be, deadly if I get it. But I mean, obviously you still worry and take precautions and all that kind of stuff. But I don't know what it was of just like not being in that close proximity to a group of people for ages or what it was. But I was just like, nope, can't do this. And felt panicky for like a good couple of hours afterwards, just not,
It's interesting. My dad just turned 99.
Oh.
He's 1 year younger than Norman Lear, who's turning 100. My dad is 99, and he really can't, he's blind, and he can't really walk, and he can't really remember anything. But I call him a few times a week just to say hello. And it's good because when he can't remember anything, I could tell him something funny 3 times in the conversation, and he laughs each time because he forgot that he already heard it like 5 minutes before. Well, during this time, you have these miraculous events happen. I called Dad up, and he said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Well," I explained the lockdown and COVID, and they're looking for a vaccine. And suddenly he starts on this monologue. And he said, "Stephen, this reminds me so much of the beginning of the polio epidemic. And nobody knew what caused polio. And we were deadly afraid. We just knew that people would be crippled and people would die. And for that one, it was children who mainly got polio. But for 90% of the people, it was asymptomatic, which I never knew. That polio only really hit like 10%, and those people, it could be very, very serious. And they called on Dad to be one of the first physicians in Oak Cliff. This is in the 1950s. So this is going back. One of the first physicians, they had a group of 4 of them to inoculate what turned out to be our elementary school. So they had all the school students line up, like 600 of them, and Dad gave them the shot. And he said, "I was a young physician. Nobody knew what polio was. I was so scared that I would get sick from one of these kids and bring it home to you and to our family. And I'd be responsible for bringing that in. But what could we do?" I shared this memory with my brother, Paul. And Paul was at the school at that time. And he remembered it. And he said, "Oh, I had a completely different memory of that. I was thinking of Dad as a hero because my father was one of the 4 doctors that were inoculating all the children against polio. And I was so proud. I remember I was bragging that was my dad up there." And it was a slice of history that mirrors this time that now people don't know. People don't know that there was another pandemic in the 1950s that terrified the world. And that still, in fact, yesterday we were having a Seder, and 2 members of my family have become, I guess, what is it when your cousin has a child? My grand cousin daughter? I don't know what that relation is.
No.
My cousin's daughter.
Okay.
So
yeah,
2 daughters, they're female, which is important because I think so many of the women are on the front line of this. My son's girlfriend is on the front line of COVID at Johns Hopkins, but 2 of my relatives are going to Africa to fight polio. like it still exists.
Yeah.
And it brought up this story again to where, again, it's hard not to make the connection to magic and brave souls with magic in their hands going to fight a dark, invisible enemy. Again, magic and science, I don't know. I like what you said originally. I think that it's going to be a time that's going to mark us. It's going to change us in ways that we just don't even know. And it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting growing up from here to see what is done differently in the future because of this. Because it'll change everybody.
Yeah, it's like I mentioned 9/11 earlier. I interviewed a survivor of 9/11, a guy named Joe Ditmar, who was in the second tower to get hit on 9/11, and was walking down the stairwell when the plane hit.
Oh.
Amazing story, right? And but it was interesting for me as someone who, because I'm 25 now, so I have one memory of 9/11. I have like one very fleeting memory of 9/11, and that's that I got home from school. Well, probably I don't even know what year I'd be in, because I'd been like 6, and like I couldn't watch any of my children's TV programs, right? Because the news was just, and so I just remember that. That's all I remember is going, why can't I watch the thing? And vaguely, and I don't even know if I've put the memory in my mind, remember seeing the towers on the TV, but that probably didn't even happen, right? So it was interesting for me to talk to someone who was there, because I think for people my age, and I was having a conversation with my friend about this, like people our age who can sort of remember it but can't properly, but for the rest of their life, it's the world sort of changed on that day, and we look at it. And so it was interesting to talk to someone who was actually there because of that. And I feel like, in different ways, but COVID is probably the first big monumental thing that I've lived through in my life, that people who are 5 or 6 years old will be sort of asking about when they're older, because they can't really remember it, but they were there, and it's that sort of inflection point in time kind of thing.
Yeah, it's the 9/11 was an event. It was a day. It was a day in which this thing happened, and that's why we still take off our shoes at airports unless we pay extra money to not take off our shoes, and our belts, and we no electronics. We still do that because of 9/11, and people will forget that was because of 9/11, and the Nigerian who had explosives in his underwear, and we'll forget those specifics of what that time was. And, there'll be, I remember a friend of mine, his story of 9/11. It was just such an unusual story. He was an actor in New York, and his only job was to be a delivery person and audition. And he was delivering something to 9/11, to the World Trade Center when the planes hit. And so he starts running like crazy and pedaling his bike, going like nuts. And the buildings start coming down, and the concrete dust and engulfs him, and he's running down the street, and he can't see, and he's feeling beside him, and he feels like a car next to him. So he opens a door and jumps into the car, and it's a police car. And he has jumped into the back seat of a police car, and there are 2 policemen in the front seat. And he looked up, and he's covered with ash, and he says, what do you think we should do? And the 2 police officers looked at each other and then looked back at him and said, well, now's when we pray. And Greg goes like, okay, I don't know if I want to stay in this car. And he jumped out of that car and he ran as fast as he could north. But he still remembers that day. This has been a year so far that has made an impression on our minds, and it's going to affect the way we love one another, and it's going to affect the way we work. Zoom will stick around, but we won't remember that Zoom came from this period of time. That's why we have this Zoom thing. And then people will hack Zoom mercilessly and find a way to get into our finances through Zoom, and then we're all lost. So there'll be all sorts of repercussions from this that'll be hard to explain to people who didn't experience it. Hard to explain. There'll be little symptoms of it, just like the Holocaust. People won't know or remember or imagine what the Holocaust is except in movies. And they won't believe that millions of people were scientifically exterminated. Yet, there was science at work there. And they go like, well, people wouldn't do that. Oh, yeah, they would. Sure. And people who did that also liked Beethoven. And they liked Brahms and Mozart, and they read poetry and read great novels. So art didn't really protect anyone from behaving badly. So, we'll carry so many of these lessons with us as kind of fragments. I think each generation puts the mosaic together a different way, and they look at their little artwork that they've created of bits and pieces of shiny glass from the past, and they go like, okay, this is the picture of my life. I don't know what it means, but I like it.
Shall we talk about something else?
Yes, sir. Yeah, you name it. You name it.
Not that, that's not all important and everything, but also I think everyone is probably at the point with COVID that...
Yeah, we're sick of it. I'm with it, yeah.
So, what I'm like at this point? I don't usually have a plan. But I thought, I was looking at your IMDb last night, and then I thought, I've never read the IMDb trivia section on Stephen Tobolowsky.
Neither have I.
Have you read it? Whoa, okay.
No.
Well, this is going to be fun then.
Okay, let's see. Let's see if I know anything about me.
Or whether it's right. And that's another, that's another thing. Apparently you were a good baseball player as a child. That's something I've learned.
Well, everyone in Dallas, everyone in Texas is a good baseball player. You grow up playing baseball and football, and your dream always was to be either a pitcher or a quarterback. And it's hard times when you realize you're too heavy to be a quarterback, and they're going to put you on the line, and you're going to get murdered. But yeah, my brother was really super good, and I was capable. I was good.
Oh, okay. But it made it sound like you were potentially like going to be an athlete before.
Well, I wanted to be an athlete, but again, that was just childhood, and that wasn't based on skill. That was based on dreams.
I wanted to be I wanted to be David Beckham. So
yeah, exactly.
Didn't happen. There's one here which I don't think we've talked about. I may have heard you talk about it somewhere else, so forgive me, but then I feel like you've got so many stories, you've probably told them everywhere anyway. But there says here, was almost murdered twice in 1 week in Hartford, Connecticut by different people.
Yeah. It was well, Hartford turned out to be kind of a rough town. I don't know if you have something comparable in England, are you outside London? Are you in
I'm
London?
in London.
You're in London.
I'm from Bristol, in London.
So there may be a neighborhood that's like, and also you have to remember where they usually put actors up is kind of dangerous sort of thing. So I think
all the place to put actors as well, somewhere where there's imminent danger. Actors are not the people that are prepared for that kind of thing.
I was working at the Hartford Stage Company. Okay. And then after we finished the play, my girlfriend Beth and I, she wrote the play. We would walk maybe a half a mile to our apartment, which was called the Asylum. That's what the name of the apartment building was, the Asylum. And we had a room at the Asylum. And next to the Asylum was a pub. So quite often we would go in there and have a beer and then go up to bed. And then down from the pub, there was a little grocery store. So sometimes we would go down to that little grocery store. So on a Tuesday and a Thursday of the same week, I was going to the grocery store, and there were two men and a woman coming to the grocery store too. So I decided I would hold the door open for them. But the door opened the wrong way than I thought. So my arm was going across the empty door to open the door instead of pulling it back in front of me. So the man pulled out a knife and said, "You blocking our way? You blocking the way of my lady?" And I go, "No, sir." And then he puts the knife into the belt of my overcoat, into my stomach, and I would have felt it if I went where. He says, "You blocking my way?" I go, "No, sir, no, sir. I meant no disrespect. I was only trying to open the door for you. That's all I was trying to do." So that was like on Tuesday, right? Had a knife in my stomach. Then on Thursday, Beth and I went to the pub, and I was playing Fireball, my favorite game. Pinball was Fireball. Oh God. So I'm playing Fireball and I'm doing pretty well. And Beth comes up to me and she says, "Sweetie, will you help me? I can't get this guy off of me." And I'm thinking she's speaking metaphorically. And I'm still playing Fireball and I'm very onto the board of pinball. And I said, "Well, just a second. I'm about to get my free ball." And then I look, and this guy is literally on Beth. He's over her back. He's grabbing her in front, and he's like wrestling with her, and she's trying to wrestle free. Now, I'm wearing an overcoat and have an attaché case that has all my stuff from my dressing room. I don't look like a tough guy. And I have my glasses and I'm balding. So I look more like an insurance salesman.
You're quite tall though, right? So
I am 6'3". Yes, I'm 6'3".
Us tall guys get a little bit of an advantage.
We have an advantage. So anyway, I put my briefcase down and I grabbed this guy by the shoulders and I said, "Get off of my girl." And I push him, and he goes back, and he comes back with a gun, and he says, and I grab my little briefcase, and I start walking, and he comes behind me. He says, "Turn around, sucker! Turn around, sucker! Turn around! It's payday, sucker! Come on!" And he says some other words too that are not as nice as sucker. I mean, sucker is just turn around! It's payday, man! It's payday, man! Turn around! And I'm walking through this bar. It's all full. And this guy is behind me the whole time. Turn around. And I go, Beth, we got to go now. And she's sitting down at the table. She says, "Well, sweetie, let me finish my drink first." I said, "No, now is not the time that we finish our drink. Now is the time that we leave the bar." And so I grab Beth by the hand, and we run out, and because I knew this neighborhood very well from the grocery store and everything, I went out the front. I pushed this guy back. I ran out the front door with Beth and around the corner, and I knew that there was a little cubby hole on the side of the bar where they guess they had trash cans or something. And I pulled her around, and we hid in there. And then I hear this guy coming out of the bar. "Hey, sucker! Where are you? Where are you, mother?" And all this. And so that was on a Thursday. So then I'm thinking like, well, that's it for that bar and that's it for that grocery store. And now we're done. So, that was Tuesday and Thursday.
That's quite a week. That is quite a week.
Not a good week. Yeah.
And just above that in your trivia section is once held hostage at gunpoint at a supermarket in Snyder Plaza in Dallas.
Yeah, and that was, oh God, now I did a podcast on that one called Light of the First Day.
I think this is where I've heard this story, because I'm sure I've heard you tell this, yeah.
And this is the guy, again, I was with Beth. Beth was at home, and I went to the grocery store to get chicken and something for, maybe some red wine or something for dinner. And they had mangoes on sale, which was a new fruit in Texas. So I thought, well, this will be cute. I'll get mangoes for Beth. She'll be so, was it mangoes? I think it was mangoes. Mangoes or papaya? Now I'm kidding. Anyway, this guy came up to me and said, I see you have, the most exotic of fruits. And I think, well, I'll give him some of these and maybe this guy will go away from me. And he pulled a gun out and stuck it in my head, and he starts crying and says, I don't know why I picked you today. I don't know why. And that's when I see the store is empty. And I was so busy going through the mangoes to try to figure out which one is ripe and which one was not, because I had no idea if red is good or green is bad. I didn't know, or shaking them. I ended up hostage with this guy for, I don't know how long, 45 minutes, an hour, with the gun to my head. And I was just talking nonstop. And then I decided I'm going to have to make a break. So I say to him, this is how I got out of it. I got out of it by saying, oh, what time do you have? So he's got the gun to my head, and he looks at his watch, and he's going like, oh, I go, oh gosh, my girlfriend's going to be worried for me. We have dinner. Hey, I don't know about you, but it's interesting me getting all this stuff out. I feel like I'm getting a lot out of this. I don't know if you are, because I was talking about mythical problems I was having with my father. And I said, you got anything happening tonight? You want to come on over to our house and have dinner? I mean, we're going to have chicken and hey, let me give you my address. And so I tore off part of the bag that had the groceries in it. And I said, do you have a pin on you? In a scene that was so weird, it would never be in a movie. The guy has a gun to my forehead, and he reaches into his pocket to hand me his fountain pen. And I was so tired and scared, I could not think of a phony address. So I write down my real address. I give it to him. I said, okay, I'm going to check out. Now just come on over and you'll meet Beth, and we'll have mangoes and wine together, and we keep talking. And I walk, and as I'm walking, I pass him. I feel the gun go into the back of my head, and a little voice in my head said, don't turn around, whatever you do, don't turn around. And I got to the corner of the grocery aisle. It says, you get around that corner, you could run, and then you'll be free. You'll run and you could be free. But what happened was, I got to the corner, and before I ran, by my talking to this guy for 40 minutes, keeping him occupied, it gave the SWAT team a chance to come in the back of the store, and they worked their way down the opposite aisles of the store. And when I got to the corner, they jumped over the food. Like those aisles are like 7 feet higher. They jumped over the food and had this guy bound and gagged and tied up within 8 seconds. And I'm walking around in the empty grocery store, and I go to an empty checkout counter after they pulled this guy out of the store. And I'm just alone, shaking like a leaf. A cop comes up to me and pats me on the back and says, hey, pal, you could just leave. I go, oh, thanks. And it was the only time I ever went to a grocery store and didn't pay for my groceries. I got home, and Beth said, well, where were you? I said, well, I was just held hostage at gunpoint. And she said, well, that takes a long time. I said, yeah, the hostage thing takes a lot longer than you would expect. Yeah, but that was true. Oh, terrible time, terrible day. Oh.
You could have been a hostage negotiator, though, by the sounds of things. Sounds like you did pretty well. I had a not the same at all. Definitely wasn't held at gunpoint. But I had this weird thing recently where I was in the supermarket, but it was in I'd say like a small grocery store, I guess would be. And I heard this guy come in, and I'd actually seen him on my way, and I think he was homeless, definitely had some mental health problems, because he was walking around like shouting really aggressively at people and swearing at them and all this kind of stuff. And I could hear him just like working his way around the supermarket, like threatening people, all this kind of stuff. And he gets to my aisle, and I thought, oh, like, brace yourself sort of thing. You know, he's going to... And he just turned to me, and I just smiled at him because I just thought, I'll try and... So I just gave him a smile and like nodded. And he just went, all right, mate, how are you? How's it going? All right? And I just went, yeah, fine. Yeah, not bad. You? And he was like, yeah. And then he just like walked off to another aisle and then just started shouting at someone.
Oh my God.
And I was like, that is the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. I don't know. Maybe it was, I don't know if it was because I acknowledged him in some way, that maybe it, whatever was going on in his mind, it diffused it, or he thought he knew me, or whatever it was. I don't know, but it was that was weird.
You acknowledge the holiness of his humanity.
Yeah.
You could be a hostage negotiator.
Yeah. I found this interesting. It says, and sorry, I'm probably going to butcher the first name, but it says one of the actor's heroes is his late aunt, Hermine Tobolowsky.
That is correct.
Known as the mother of the Texas Equal Rights Amendment.
Yes.
And I thought that would be an interesting thing to talk about. I don't know anything.
It is very interesting. Hermine was a great, great woman, and she was one of my heroes. Jaime and Hermine. Jaime is my uncle who hired me when I was 13, 14, 15 years of age to work at his store. Hermine, his wife, ended up being in the Texas government, either as a senator or representative, something like that. And she was for women's rights and the Equal Rights Amendment. And I had no idea at the time that she had threats against her life. People threw bricks through her window and everything like that. I only knew of Hermine as my supporting me in the arts. When I was a little boy, I would come over to their house on Sunday afternoons after Sunday school, and they had a grand piano. And I would go in, and all the relatives were there getting food. All the ladies would make brisket or whatever, and I went to the grand piano, and I couldn't play, but I just started banging on it and slamming on the pedals and banging, and all the adults would look at me like they wanted to murder me, except for Hermine. And Hermine sat on the couch next to the piano while I played. And she said, Stephen, what are you doing? And I said, I'm telling a story. And she said, well, what is the story you're telling? And then I played the bass notes. I said, here is a monster, and he lives under the castle. And this is the princess. She's up on the tower. And then there's the stairway, and the hero is running up the stairway, and I'm banging on the piano and doing all this stuff. And she said, that is wonderful. You need to be a pianist. And she went to my mother and father and said, you need to rent a piano for Stephen. He's going to be a pianist someday. And I ended up with piano lessons and a piano because of Hermine. I ended up, right now I'm playing Beethoven sonatas, the Pathétique and the Tempest. I'm playing Brahms. I'm playing Mozart and Chopin because of Hermine, that I started taking piano when I was 7. And before Hermine passed away, she passed the Equal Rights Amendment in the state of Texas, and she was one of the people who helped author the National Equal Rights Amendment in the United States, which did not pass. And there are reasons for that, other than people not liking women. Just briefly, it was the Vietnam War was also in full swing, and if there were equal rights, people were saying at the time that mean our daughters would have to be drafted because the United States had a draft. And so men, women, families did not want their daughters to be drafted. And so there was a lot of resistance to that version until they got rid of the draft. And then you had you had the volunteer army so that you wouldn't have the same problem now. But I asked Hermine, how did you get it passed in the state of Texas? And I bring this up because it's important now. It's important always. She said, I appealed to people's self-interest. She said, in Texas, men controlled the finances of a family. If a woman came, a woman couldn't get a credit card back then. A woman could get a bank account as long as her husband set up the bank account for her. So she mentioned to her husband, Jaime, saying, it's terrible that if anything happened to you, we would end up having to put you in a home. And he says, what do you mean, a home? Well, we couldn't keep you here because I have no access to finances. We wouldn't be able to hire a nurse. I wouldn't be able to hire anything if you were incapacitated. And people got on the bandwagon of going, wait a minute. We have to give women the right to make us more comfortable. If anything terrible happens to us, we have to have women have the rights to their own finances. And once women had the rights to their own finances in Texas, then they had the right, then they were getting jobs, then they were going into the labor force, and then full equality was coming. But that's the way Hermine did it, was appealing to men's self-interest in giving women equal rights.
Wow. I'm glad I asked about Hermine.
She's amazing, amazing.
So there you have it, Stephen Tobolowsky. My thanks to Stephen for joining me on the show once again, and my thanks to you, the listener, for joining me this week. If you do like the podcast, then subscribe if you haven't already on whatever podcast platform you're on, and share it with your friends, your family, the people on the street. Accost them. Well, don't accost them. That would be probably illegal. Just politely suggest to passers-by that they listen to this podcast. And yeah, join me next time. But until then, I've been James Albarn, and this is The Last Line.